Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chelsea Shammy Calder, and I'm your session host today. Up next, we'll be joined by Mary Joy from SAS, and she is going to be covering procurement integrity. I usually have this up on the slide, but you're all good. She's doing a live demo, so you'll get it all right here, right now. Please join me in welcoming Mary Joy to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm thrilled to get a great crowd, and hopefully you all are enjoying your time at SAS Innovate. Hopefully you're enjoying your lunch, too. If you step out for an extra sandwich or extra dessert, it's right there, so no worries at all. But super thrilled to be here. Thank you again for taking the time to come. I'll just quickly tell you a little bit about myself before I get into the demo. I've worked at SAS for a little over 2 years at this point. I work within our risk, fraud, and compliance division, where, yes, it's great, it's a great team, where I get the opportunity to kind of be a good blend between the business and the technical side. And so I really like my role a lot. I've started off my career actually working in the financial services industry, pivoting to nonprofit before now being in tech. But I studied business and computer science, so this is a really good fit of a role. And I get to solve some interesting problems. And so the interesting problem that we're gonna get to go through today is around the idea of procurement integrity. And so when I say procurement integrity, it can conjure up some different thoughts. But what I mean by procurement is I mean the spending of money on goods and services. And so what our solution does is our solution allows us to look at, hey, where are you spending money? And ultimately, where does it need to be spent? And then looking for maybe some fraud or abuse, some deliberate issues, or some just waste and error. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we can use analytics to capitalize on that, to better understand where our money's going and help it go as much as possible to where you want it to be going. So I'm going to be doing a live demo today. I'll briefly just show you, right now we're in our Visual Investigator area of SAS. And you all are pretty familiar with SAS, hopefully, and so you're able to see we've got a ton of different options within our end-to-end platform. But we're going to be focusing on a couple areas. We're going to look at Visual Investigator, and ultimately what it's going to be doing is answering the question, hey, I've got a lot of vendors. Which ones are suspicious? Who do I need to be looking at with a little bit more scrutiny? And then what we're going to do is we're going to look into intelligent decisioning, which is going to help us look and understand behind the scenes how the scenarios and how these fraud schemes that we're looking for are created, how they could be configured. And then we're going to look at some reports too. And so with that, I'll jump into it. So one thing you'll notice when you see this is you'll see the words continuous monitoring, and I just want to flag that because it's got a ton of value, and it's also got the element of being able to see how we're able to look at monitoring in real time. And so what that allows us to do is not just every year, every month, be able to get a sense of what's going on. We're able to get a sense of what's going on as it's going on. And so, yeah, we're gonna look at this now. And so we're gonna start with the question of, all right, how do I look at what's going on and how do I see, all right, who do I start with and where do I go? So let's look at my list of suppliers. So assume you're a company that has suppliers. Now, if you've got 10 suppliers, you probably know who the 10 are pretty well. But if you don't know who the 10 are, you probably want to look and you probably have more than 10. You probably have maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of vendors. And so what I see here with this list is I'm able to see my list of suppliers. Now, I can see across these different columns, there's different elements on who these suppliers are. And so we can see one column that's particularly important is the score column. And that's a risk score. And we'll talk a little bit more in that. We'll unpack that a bit more. But what the risk score does is this allows us to see, hey, we've got a lot of vendors. Which ones do I need to actually be focused on? And so we can see there's a couple different dimensions. We can also see other columns like red flags, number of alerts, and other information about what quantity of transactions are they doing with us, what kind of business are they doing with us. But we see this top one, and you know what? Let's actually look a little bit more into this company called Depina. So they're one of our suppliers or vendors, and we can see some information along the bottom here. But we'll find out more once I actually click on them. And so when I click on them, I can see more information. In the top left, I can see a little bit just about who they are as a vendor. And again, if you had a couple vendors, you might know who they are, but when you've got hundreds, thousands in scale, you don't know who they all are, probably. And so this allows us to get a better sense of what's going on, what they're doing, and who they are. Now, in the bottom left, I can see a chart, and we'll see more charts later on, and we'll see more in reporting later on, but ultimately what this allows us to do is this allows us to not just see lists of numbers, but visualize potentially what's going on. And we can see here, we'll dive into this a bit more, but we can see there's this period where the payments were significantly higher than both the orders coming through and the invoices. So that's kind of strange in itself. But let's focus actually on the right-hand side, because that's what I want to spend a lot of our time on, which is on scenarios. And this scorecard lists the different scenarios that were flagged for this vendor. Now, what scenarios are is they are increased likelihood of loss, and they're potentially precarious situations on really asking the question, why is this happening? Now, one scenario flagging isn't indicating this is 100% fraud by any means, but when you see things happening repeatedly and when you see multiple different types of scenarios firing, ultimately that's when suspicion gets raised, and that's when it contributes to the score and that risk score that we have here. And so that's why we have a risk score of 980. And so I'm not going to go through every scenario, but let's look at a couple we see here on the right. So we see vendors with the same address, different names. That's flagged as one of the most suspicious scenarios, and rightly so in many ways. It could just be a transcription error, copy-paste error, why there's multiple addresses for a vendor, or it could indicate some kind of collusion or some more devious activity on what's actually going on. We can see the same with other different pieces of contact information, like telephone number. And then, there's other things and schemes that could be going on too. One is invalid tax ID numbers, multiple bank accounts, round amount transactions. I have to try hard when I'm at the gas station trying to get it to be, 0-0 if I'm trying to make it an even. It's hard to make things even transactions, but we can see this is an example of, all right, if you keep having perfect amount transactions, that could be an issue too. But could also be coincidental, which is why it's not the highest risk score. But we can also see there's scenarios based on maybe, for example, for orders. If there's the same order number with different vendors. That's also, questionable. Or an order just below approval limits. Like if there's a certain limit that the company has as an internal control, and you have multiple transactions hitting just below it, you might wonder, is that random? Or does someone know the rule and maybe there's some kind of, internal conflict and internal, issue going on there with personnel knowing things and sharing that information with vendors? That could be an issue. So those are just some examples of scenarios. But let's actually go into the fact that, we see these scenarios going off and we want to know more about what's actually happening. So if I go into my alert activity, I can see information on the alerts that actually fired. Now, one example of that is vendors with the same address, different names. We talked about that. That's always a little suspicious because you're like, all right, maybe they changed names and it wasn't updated in one system and another. Maybe there is something else going on. Maybe there's some collusion going on. But we can see in this, we've got our DePina. That's our vendor that we're taking a deeper look at. But we see this other supplier too here. And we're like, who is that? I don't know. So we should eventually look into that and try to get an understanding of who they are. And if I wanted to, I could click on them and get more information. But we'll see them a little bit more in our workspace too as we get into this. But I can go through my other scenarios too. Again, we looked at all these scenarios because they fired on the scorecard. And we can get more information about any of these specific transactions and when they occurred, that we could dive more into all of this. So now I want to get a little bit into supplier details. So we talked about the fact that there's many vendors going on, and we've got this vendor here called DePina. Now, we want to get a sense, who are they really? What are they doing? And one element I want to call our attention to, here we can see some information up top. We can also see here a network, and we'll get into that in a bit. But the really cool part too is, it seems simple, but it's got this section called export related details. And that means with the click of a button, I can download all the purchase orders for this vendor, or all the invoices, or all the payments. And it sounds kind of simple, but the value in that is actually the fact that if you're at all familiar with procurement systems, usually all the data you need is not in one place. It's usually actually in multiple places, if not as many pieces of data you need, that number of systems. And so what this allows us to do is this allows us to quickly reduce the data silos because you can more immediately get the information you need and have it at your fingertips. And so that's a value of this solution, again, is breaking down the data silos and getting it all within this system in near real time. And so I can get other information about how they're operating and the kind of business they're doing if I continue scrolling down and find out more about Dependent. But I want to go actually now a little bit more into the workspace. And I alluded to this, but we looked at that other network diagram and it looked like a lot was going on. But let's actually look more into specifically what's going on. And so right now we see this alert firing and we can see our organization here, Dependent. And if I open up the icon, I can see what these different icons are. So I can see our supplier, our vendor, Dependent, and I can expand it to get a little bit more information about who they are. All right, and so I've got this supplier, vendor, and then this organization, and I want to expand it again, see what is going on. And I can see a lot of information in here. And honestly, I could say, you know what, maybe this is too much information for me to look at right now. Let's focus on a certain element. So I can actually, instead of just expanding it in general, I can expand it by type. And so let's say I want to look at the accounts, specific accounts tied to our organization. I can click on that and we can expand just that. If I wanted to, I could do it for other elements as well. But now it's a little bit more manageable and I can see all the accounts directly tied to this organization, to Dependent. And if you notice, there's one of these that is not like the other. If you look at this one, this has a number in the top left, and you might have seen these numbers in the other elements too, but that means there's something else tied to this. And so this one is an interesting one because there's got that one. So if I expand this one further, I look and I see that other vendor, Afforda. If you remember that from before, that was the other vendor that shared the same address. And so it's kind of interesting how you can see through a network diagram how they're connected and ultimately what they're doing. And maybe you were able to have seen that connection by looking at each specific alert before, but if you also view it in this kind of network diagram, you're able to visualize it in a different way and see how they're connected in ways that you might not be able to see just looking at the actual information in the form of tables. And so we could talk a lot more in the visual investigator space, and I'm happy to do that, happy to answer questions later. But I want to shift us now a little bit more into the behind the scenes on how did we come up with these scenarios? How are they built? And so I'm going to go into this other section here. So I'd open this up and I'd go into our Build Decisions tab. I have the tab open right here, and so we'll just go into this now. But this is our area where we do all the decisioning logic and look at the scenarios and construct them. And so not only construct them, but we can just configure them there too. But part of the big value add, which I'll reiterate in a bit too, is the fact that none of this is random. None of the scenarios are random. How did they come up with? It's all transparent, and you can actually see what's going on and how these decisions are being made. So if I go in here and I click on decisions, I can see a list of different decisions I have, and the one that I thought was interesting that we can maybe look at is the one around purchase orders. Now, if you remember from our scenarios, one of the alerts, a couple of them fired based on purchase order. So if I open this up and get a better sense of unusual transactions around purchase orders, here I can see a flow. And this might seem familiar. I think even in the earlier session today, we had that PM, product manager, talk about intelligent decisioning, and she showed a little bit of the flow. But here I'm going to use it more in the context of that story we've been telling to figure out what vendor, what vendors aren't doing what they should be doing, and then again, how did we come up with that scenario? Now, if I open up this side panel here, you see these different objects that come through. Now, some of them range from, information like pretty simple business rules, business logic, but some of them get a little bit more in depth too. Like looking at Python code and putting that in. And these can all be added in here as specific nodes. And I'll show you now kind of an example of a node. Now, each of these have different things that they're looking for as nodes. The one I'm going to look at, with same order, different vendors, that's interesting. Orders below approval limits. Let's look at this one and open this up to see what this actually looks like. Now up top, we've got a lot of logic in here to see what is going on, but a lot of this up here is more just setting up the variables. The logic comes in when I go down here a little bit further, and I can see ultimately how these rules are being created. And even better, how these rules can be configured if I need to configure them. And I'll just open this up to show you. It looks a little bit more complicated than it is. Really all it is it's taking variables and coming up with simple statements using Boolean logic to better understand what you want it to do. And so this is looking ultimately, again, about how much percentage of an order is below the threshold limit. And then from there, you can make different statements off of it and have it trigger for different actions on different flags when we're actually looking at what's going on. And so this is just a sample. There's a lot more. If we had more time, I could show you with intelligent decisioning. But this is just trying to give you a flavor of those scenarios we saw earlier that comprise the scorecard, how they're built, what they look like on the backside, and then if we wanted to, how we could configure them too. And that's important too, because not only is it transparent, not black box, but it's also allows us to be adaptable, because we know fraud schemes are not one time and set. They're constantly evolving and they're constantly getting smarter, and this allows us to stay on top of it. And one piece in here that we can also add in, I just want to note, is the model piece as well. And that's great because we can take advantage of our advanced modeling capabilities. We can create our own models, we can use models that were preset and configure them. But when we include them in here, we're able to get smarter and make better decisions on, is this actually fraud? Is this actually suspicious procurement transaction? Based on your company and based on your data, not based on more general data, but learning off your own data itself too. And I'll wrap by going into our visual analytics, and so that's here in our Explore and Visualize. And I just want to show a couple things around visual analytics. Some of you may be familiar with it, but what it is it's our tool for being able to create advanced reporting. And now I'll open up a sample report, and I like this report a lot for a couple different reasons, but the best thing about it is it kind of shows a couple different images of what this could be. It shows a little bit of the art of the possible. Now in here, this is just a sample of a report. The great thing about it, if I wanted to, I could actually go in here and go into edit mode, and I could take my variables, I could look at the kind of charts that are available, and quite simply drag and drop these into here. But I won't go into the in-depth element of visual analytics. There's plenty more we could talk about with that. But I just want to focus on high level, what could this do and how could this be valuable for you? And if I'm trying to figure out which vendors are suspicious, I could go in depth to look at the vendor by vendor, but I also could zoom out and take a bird's eye view of what's going on trend-wise with how these alerts are firing and what scenarios are hitting for my customers or for my transactions. And now here I can see just some basic information. I've got some tables, I can see some charts, and I can see my number of incidents, my number of alerts. And if you remember, we actually spend time in that PI supplier monitoring part of this. Now, I can also look at other ways of looking at this if I'm curious on which scenarios, which incidents seem to be most popular. I can look at it that way. Again, we can see some familiar ones that we looked at. I think we looked at same order, different vendor. We looked at a couple other elements of this too. And the value of all of this is it's the same data within the system. So whether I'm building a report off of it, whether I'm working on the decisioning logic, or whether I'm looking actually in Visual Investigator and trying to analyze the specific case, I can see what the potential issues could be and look at it with a little bit more depth. And then this is just another example of how I can use charts. There's so many other charts I could use. This is just a simple bar chart, but this is just a way to visualize the data in a different way. And we even have in here some automated explanations, and we've got looking at data over time. And so there's so much we can do with all of this in visual analytics that just are able to take our data and look at it a little bit more clearly and get a better sense of truly what's going on now and what could be going on in the future. And so with that, I'll take us back to our visual investigator piece, because this is the core element of it. This is the element where we're first able to look at our vendors, get a sense and prioritize risk of who could be doing the most suspicious things, and then figure out, again, from there, what we're trying to see. If we're trying to go in at a micro level, if we're trying to zoom out at a macro level, we can get the information we need from this, and ultimately make and leverage this tool to be as helpful as possible for us. And so with that, I'll wrap, and I'm happy to talk any further about procurement integrity. It's gotten incredibly popular, especially nowadays with looking for opportunities to save money. The benefit of this solution is people are already spending money, and this helps as much money that you're spending as possible to go where it needs to go. And so being able to look at it from the lens of what could be wasteful spending, what could be fraudulent spending, how do we capture as much as that possible for you all? So with that, I just want to thank you for spending your time with me, and be happy to address any questions and talk after as well. So thank you very much.